And thank you, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you this morning. I have the honor of being your keynote speaker, but I also have the challenge of getting through my keynote so you guys can get off the ship to Key West. So I am between you and the sun.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure.
We choose you.
Oh. So one of the other roles that I've recently been asked to take on, I believe it's starting in June, is they have asked me to be a board member of the Greater New Jersey chapter, where I will sit and lend my voice as a person who's actually living with the disease. One of the most important things that any organization that is serving the population of those of us living with this disease is to really have a voice of the person, of people who are living with the disease, helping them guide their mission. And I'm very fortunate that that could happen, that is going to happen. And if there's somebody else here in the audience that I would love to see on the Delaware Valley board, is my dear friend Phil here. So I'll be gently nudging him in that direction this trip. Nudge, nudge. He's a great advocate and has a great voice as well. Excuse me. Hopefully our technology will behave for us this morning. So far, so good. As Lisa described, I had spent many months trying to get an accurate diagnosis of what was going on with me neurologically prior to my actual diagnosis in 2016 of March. Prior to that, I always used the term misdiagnosis, but most recently I actually was sitting with my neurologist, and he was the primary investigator for the trial that I was on, and he said, Jeff, it's really not a misdiagnosis, it's just that they don't know. And that's one of the problems about this disease. A lot of times is, and when I say disease, let me be very open and frank with you. I'm saying Alzheimer's, but it's really any neurodegenerative disease. FTD, Lewy body, vascular. I mean, we're all in the same boat. We're all under the same umbrella of dementia. Mine just happens to be Alzheimer's. But he had said to me that the problem is that they really didn't know to actually give me a diagnosis. So that was one of the problems that we were going through. But what was happening to me was I was having issues with my memory, short term. And in fact, at first my wife and I were joking because we would call it selective memory, like ignoring my wife. But later we would find out that certainly it was just things that she would say and conversations that we would have, and it just turns out that it was my memory, short-term memory, was being affected. As time goes by, as time went on, we would also find out that memory is not so bad, but really the things that affect me and may affect you as well is my cognition, ability for multitasking, and then there are some times when I have some speech issues, and I believe that the correct terminology for it, and I'll lean more towards the scientists in the group, but I believe it's called aphasia. Is when you lose the ability to formulate words. You know what you want to say, but it's just so difficult to articulate the words. I always tell my wife it's nouns. I have problems with nouns because I can get the entire sentence out, and then when I want to, basically say the thing that I'm talking about, it's like a person, place, or thing issue, right? So I tell my wife I blame it on it's the noun's fault. It's and it ends up being a whatchamacallit or a thingy. So that's what it kind of translates down to most of the time. But part of the diagnosis too, or as I was being diagnosed, I was really feeling quite a bit of stress and anxiety. Excuse me. And most of that really comes from the not knowing. Is you're going through this really awful time of all of these neurological things that are happening to you, and there's times when you're thinking to yourself, am I losing my mind? Is this, am I making this up? Is this something that's real? And I went into this really just amazing time of stress and anxiety where it was really starting to affect me physically. It was all of the stress was manifesting itself very physically, and so I started having twitching and facial drooping, balance issues. My mood was I kind of had sunken quite a bit. So this is just a photo of a 2-week stay that I had in one of the hospitals, one of the 5 hospitals, I think, four or five hospitals that I was actually admitted to while they were trying to figure out what was wrong with me. But this next video is actually a video that was taken of me while I was actually in the hospital, and they were trying to figure out what was going on. But this is the twitching. I was just twitching all over the place. Constant twitching. And what the doctors described it as was myoclonic twitching, uncontrollable, involuntary myoclonic twitching. Myoclonic twitching, what I found was, or the way it was described to me was, when you go to sleep at night and your legs kind of involuntarily like twitch. That's called a myoclonic twitch. Well, I had that going on all day long for I don't know how long, and it was just really disturbing. And that's why I had whoa, Nelly. It's like I had no idea what was going on. But let me just go to the next slide here. But all of that transpired into when we finally got our diagnosis. I remember meeting with our neurologist from Columbia Medical Center of Neurology. She was wonderful. She spent, I think, 2 hours with us. I had a neuropsychological exam. I had what they call a mini memory exam as well. And then what they did was a spinal tap. And they from the spinal tap, what they did was they were able to exclude the what they thought may have been Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which is more commonly known as mad cow disease, and they were able to exclude the Huntington's disease because of the shaking. But what they did find in my spinal fluid was the toxic tau protein, which is a byproduct of the Alzheimer's disease. So given that, and given the neurological, the neuropsychological exam that I had taken, the diagnosis was made at that point of, I believe it was MCI, right? Well, MCI and the doctor really said, but it's more than likely Alzheimer's. So, and that's really part of the problem with this disease too. It's really very difficult to diagnose without a PET scan or postmortem. So after that, I was very fortunate to get into a clinical trial, which I'll talk more about. And with that clinical trial, I was able to get what's called a beta amyloid PET scan. And the beta amyloid PET scan, what it actually does is they inject you with a radioactive fluid, and that kind of adheres to the beta amyloid plaque. And then you go through a PET scan machine, and it lights up the beta amyloid plaque. So they were able to see definitely, conclusively, at that point, that there was the beta amyloid plaque on my brain. And so that from that point, I got to a clinical trial. So, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But I remember the day that Kim found out about my diagnosis. She called me up and said, I just spoke to the neurologist. I have your diagnosis. I'm coming home. So she came home. I didn't ask her any questions on the phone because I didn't want her to have to unload with me on the phone. I pretty much knew the news, whatever it was, it probably wasn't going to be good. So she had come home. We went to the park together. We sat on the park bench together, and she basically told me she spoke to the doctor, and it's conclusively it's Alzheimer's disease. And so up to that point, we really had been researching Alzheimer's disease, and we really knew what the prognosis was. So we wept. We sat on the park bench and we wept, but we pulled it together. And I told my wife right away, I said, I want to do something. I'm not going to sit back. I'm not going to sink into the shadows. I'm not going to withdraw. I said, I'm going to do something. So that's when I immediately started my advocacy work. I mean, it happened almost immediately. I contacted the Alzheimer's Association. I got on the early stage advisory group. I started advocating around the state. And in doing so, it really kind of gave me a lot of purpose. And learning and becoming educated about the disease, and then becoming educated about awareness and advocacy, that's where things began to turn for me. And so that's what I really kind of want to talk to you a little bit about right now. And what this trip is about. It's about hope. And some might think it's very difficult to how can you correlate hope to a terminal disease that has no cure or no means of slowing the progression of the disease? I mean, where do you fit hope in? Where does it plug in? Well, I think I'm not going to say I've come up with the answer for that, but I've certainly learned that there are different ways for us to hope. There are different ways for us to use hope for our lives and for our disease. And really kind of what hope kind of translates to, or the definition of hope is it's a feeling of an expectation or desire for a certain outcome, right? That's kind of the textbook definition of what hope is. So, naturally for me, what was hope, how can I turn this hopelessness that I was feeling into something hopeful? And so I started to kind of line things up and put things into perspective. And I started to realize that, okay, one of the things that is hope is getting into a clinical trial. So I did that immediately. I think within 2 weeks, I got into a clinical trial for the disease. And that went on for about 3 years. And again, I'll talk more about that. But I also got engaged with a lot of advocacy work, right? I got engaged with a lot of awareness work. I got engaged with a lot of communicating that Alzheimer's is not an old person's disease work. I was diagnosed when I was 51. Phil, how old were you?
54.
54. right? So we're young guys, you know, we're kind of in the prime of our lives. And so, so I had to kind of think, you know, where can I be hopeful about things that are really kind of outside the ultimate hope? What is, you know, about the cure? I think my next slide kind of talks about, you know, on the periphery of hope, you've got all this, you've got the diagnosis or the misdiagnosis, you've got the unknowns, and then you've got the prognosis. So the unknowns are just, you know, what's between my diagnosis and my prognosis, or the outcome of the ultimate outcome of this disease. What are excuse me, what are all the things that are happening in my life, you know, that ultimately can somehow translate into things of hope. And so that's kind of like on the periphery, on the very outside. For me, those are kind of like almost like the things that kind of bring like hopelessness to your life, right? And so I tend to want to kind of push those things away, you know, and say, it's not that I'm rejecting them. I know they exist. I know about them. I'm well informed about them. But those aren't the things that are going to drive my life. Because there's something in the middle. There's something at the core that I'm still striving for. And that kind of leads me to the next thing here. And these are things that, again, are outside the cure, the silver bullet, the cure. But these are things, to me, that resonate very strongly with what hope is. And that's care, education, and support. And those are the things that I think are really very important, and what is being done by many of the people who are here today. Caregivers, filmmakers, financial experts, authors, public speakers in dementia care. These things are the things that are really close to the concept of hope that we have today. And we have to continue to distill those things into really what is really very hopeful. And these are my circles of hope that kind of really kind of came out of a metaphor that I kind of had for really what this trip is. It's distilling these circles to get us to where hope is. And that's part of what this trip is about, is to really experience life the way you're supposed to, regardless of your diagnosis. And we're gonna take us a little bit further. But I'd like to think that the hope that we're focusing on for this trip is the care, the education, and the support. So let me take you a little further. But first, I am going to take a sip of water. And really at the fringes of my circles of hope is the awareness and the advocacy, the research funding and the clinical trials. And the reason why I have these things out there is because these things are really super important, I think. The awareness, the advocacy, the research funding and clinical trials. But I think that the things that really affect the quality of life for people right now, here today, where we stand, are the things, are care, education, and support. And that's where our culture and our society really needs to continue to focus on. With all of our energy, our scientific energy, our funding and our awareness going into ultimately a cure. But I think from what I've learned, it's not either or, it's kind of both. And but I think what's really important is to kind of really focus on the hope. that we're talking about this week. One of the things that I had to adjust my life for was change. I was 51 years old, and I was basically told I needed to retire, and it was more like there really wasn't any more. There wasn't room for me in the organization for basically what I was faced with. I couldn't do the job I was doing any longer. Before I retired, I was leading a team of a bunch of young, very bright computer scientists, and I just mentally, cognitively, I just couldn't keep up with them any longer. It was really frustrating, but I knew it was the right thing to do was to retire at that time. But I've always had this kind of mantra in my life where the only constant in life is change, which kind of sounds like a oxymoron, but it's really that's really the only constant in life. Things are always changing. Life is always changing. You constantly have to adapt to things. So that was one of the things that I needed to do. I needed to adapt to this thing that was really kind of crushing to me, because when you're in a business for 20 years, 25 years, and that really does have a lot to do to define who you are. As a computer scientist, as a software engineer, that played a huge impact to define who I was. So I had to give that up. And I've talked to doctors and lawyers who've had to give, pilots who've had to give it up. It's can be a tremendous burden on you. But for me, what I did was I embraced it, and I decided I'm going to make this work for me. I'm going to make this change thing work for me. I'm going to make this retirement thing work for me. So I started looking at the things that I had on my list to do when I retired. In 10, 15, 20 years from now, I had a list of things I wanted to do. So I was like, okay, now I'm going to start doing these things. And so it really was about, creating new experiences and learning new things. We also created a memory cafe in my town, so that we could reach out to other people to really kind of bring them along on this journey of change as well. And that's actually going fairly well at this point. We meet once a month. But it's about new hobbies, it's new experiences, and yes, it really is about creating new memories too, because I'm still creating memories for myself. Like I said before, my memory is, I don't know, my wife actually says to me, I can't remember what I did with that thing. I said, yeah, it's over there. So it's still working. I'm still pretty good with it. So I'm always creating new memories. And the thing that really helps me is I'm constantly trying to learn new things. I'm constantly trying to fire the neurons in my brain to learn new things. It doesn't have to be the thing that's the most difficult, but it's just something new. It's something that I don't know. It's a new experience. And so, for instance, I always wanted to get into photography. So my wife was nice enough after I hounded her and talked her into it she bought me a camera. So now I'm doing a lot of photography, and it was really interesting. Cameras are very complex these days. They're not like the old 110 thing where you just point and click. These things are like, you have to have Peter, you have to have a degree in mechanics or something to operate these things. But what I find myself doing is learning a new thing about it every day, learning about like what f-stop is, what a shutter speed is, this and that, how to get this to work well with this. And so all of those things, I might be terrible at it, and most of the time it's out of focus and it doesn't work. but it's just I'm still learning, and that's what's important. And again, always increasing your knowledge. Our finances aren't that great, so I'm always looking for free stuff on the internet. There's tons of free learning things on the internet. I took 2 courses from the University of Tasmania. I took 2 from the University of Tasmania, the Wickens Institute of Dementia Center, I think the last word is. But it was a 9-week course, free. I learned all about dementia. I learned understanding dementia, and the other one was, I can't remember. But there were 2. I remember there were 2. You know, just things like that. You know, playing connect the dots, or bingo, or watercoloring. Those are the things we do in our memory cafe. One of the things that I loved to do with my dad before he passed was bubble wrap. Bubble wrap is awesome. If you're bored and you can't find anything to do, and there's some bubble wrap is great. It's tactile, it's counting, it's making sure. There's so many simple little things that you can do to fire those neurons off in your brain that you can do. There's actually, if the caregivers go online, there's plenty of stuff. You probably could talk more about that than I can, but there's plenty of stuff that you can do to really, you know, fire things off. Part of change is, you know, Kim wants to know, you know, what's in my head, and sometimes it's difficult for me to communicate that change that's going on, or even the progression of the disease. It's really it can be very difficult, and this is part of what change is, or part of the changes that I'm going through, or part of the changes that you're experiencing. And so one of the things is that sometimes it's very difficult for me to articulate, you know, how I'm changing. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll say, well, if you really want to know, ask my wife, you know. And it's always interesting too is that, you know, as you're going through this change, people will come up to you who see you maybe once in a while, and generally I'm having a pretty good day, but they'll say, you know, Jeff, you look pretty good today. You don't look like you have Alzheimer's, or you don't seem to have Alzheimer's. It's not that they know I have Alzheimer's, but maybe they're thinking, you know, it's at bay or something like that. Or I'll get a complete stranger, you know, we're having a conversation, they'll be like, you know, you don't look like you have Alzheimer's. But I say, well, spend 24 hours with me, you know, experience sundowning with me, you know, go to a restaurant with me and try to help me order a meal off of a menu. You know, go into a large crowd with me. You know, go into a mall with me. You know, my wife will tell you. I mean, as caregivers, you know that you experience these things. It's like you get me in a large crowd. I'm like a little puppy, like chasing like little balls around. It's just like I'm just all over the place. You know, and so it's that's part of the change. That's part of the change as well. But one of the things that I had said to my one of the things I had said to my wife was that I told her that the thing that I use to understand and monitor my change is changing. It's very difficult for me to keep track of how I'm changing, because that thing is changing. It's beginning to fail. So I told her what's really more important is for you to help me understand how I'm changing. So Kim and I have conversations often, and she'll tell me, Jeff, this is what's happening. This is what you need to do. And we're very frank and very open about that. And we really communicate well on the way things are changing. And she she kind of keeps me up to date on things. And it's very helpful because recently she told me not to use a ladder because I had fallen down and tore my rotator cuff slightly, and I ended up in rehab for 4 or 5 weeks. So now I don't use a ladder anymore because my wife says your ladder days are over, so it's no more ladder. So those are the kind of things that you have to look to your caregiver for, is to help you understand change and accept the change that's going on in your life. However, this is a really good slide. I love this one. With change, sometimes change brings puppies into your life. So one of the things that my wife said to me was, we actually had a little I don't know what it was. What kind of dog is it? It's a Shih Tzu. And but my youngest daughter, he was my little buddy, little pal that I had during the day. He really didn't. He didn't like me all that much. Well, he did, but I would be downstairs, he'd be upstairs. So it wasn't a love story. So he went. He's living with my daughter at college because she lives off campus in a house, and I'm kind of lonely because I'm home all day long. And so my wife says, why don't we get a service dog for you? I was like, I jumped all over that. And so I did some research, and I thought the perfect service dog would be a Great Dane. So we got a Great Dane puppy who's now 6 months old and about 90 pounds. And he is just absolutely, right now he's at a boot camp for service dogs. But he brings so much joy into my life. I can't tell you how much animals or puppies are good for you. Not only for you emotionally, but we have a little bit of the empty nest syndrome going on. My wife and I, all our kids are away in college, and so there's no kids at home. So for me to care for this little puppy, it's just really exciting, and it's really sweet. It's really nice. It's really not a lot of work. Although when he jumps on me, he wants to play.
He's also not a little puppy.
No, yeah, it's true. When he jumps on me and wants to play, it's I don't know, do the math, 90 pounds, get accelerating through the air, jumping on you. It's got to be like 500 pounds coming down on top of you. But he's just so lovable, and he loves to kiss, and he loves to hug, and he's always sleeping in my lap. He sings, but he's so great. And these pictures were actually taken by a dear friend of ours, and maybe a friend of yours too, Carmen Buck. Carmen's Legacy Production. She has this thing called Doggies for Dementia, and she goes around the country and she takes pictures of families with persons living with dementia and their puppies. It's free. It doesn't cost the person anything. It's sponsored by other organizations, but that's my little buddy. His name is Buddy. I thought that would be an easy name for me to remember, so just Buddy. But there's life before and after diagnosis. We know that, and I spoke before about before the diagnosis. I really kind of identified heavily with my career. After the diagnosis, however, whoops, I went too far. After the diagnosis, I really had to reestablish or kind of repurpose myself. Naturally, as I expressed, one of the things that became very purposeful in my life was to engage with the Alzheimer's Association, indeed. However, there are also things that you need to, you really have to kind of readjust your priorities. And the things that you thought were important when you're diagnosed with a terminal disease, you have to kind of look at and say, you know what, that really wasn't that important in my life. I mean, that you know, bringing home the bacon, yeah, that's important, but really what's important to me is family, faith, friends, and those are the things ultimately that are important to me, and the most important thing. But the thing that really became very important to me, as I had said, was the awareness of the disease and helping fight for a cure. And but what's really important is that we can't let this disease or the dementia disease that we have define who we are. We are not this disease. It is a small fraction, a small percentage of who we are. And one of these exercises that I like to do with people who are living with the disease is this thing called "You Are More Than Your Diagnosis." I was diagnosed when I was 51 years old. Prior to my 51st year, I had an entire life of things that made me who I was, or made me who I am. Those things never go away. They're there forever, you know? And so what's really important is for you to kind of step back and say, okay, irrespective of this disease, I am more than this disease. Who am I? Well, I'm an IT professional, naturally, because that was my career. I'm an advocate gardener. That's one of the things that I love to do now. I love to garden. Volunteer. I love to volunteer for things. And I have to be careful with that with my wife, because generally when I volunteer her too. And I'm adventurous. I'm committed. I believe I'm a very fair person. I love to write. I'm not a very good writer. I could certainly take some lessons from my friend Phil here, and who is an expert writer. I'm patient. My family thinks I'm goofy. But there's just so many things, and then really kind of small in there, kind of baked down at the bottom, almost not visible, is living with dementia. Because that doesn't really define who I am. All these other things really define who I am, and that's the things that I'm proud of. One of the other things that I had ventured into when I was, I'm just going to pause this for a second. One of the other things that I had ventured into when I was just newly diagnosed was getting into a clinical trial. That was just so important to me because I told my wife that I wanted to do something. I just didn't want to sit back. I wanted to get involved with a clinical trial. I know there's not a lot of clinical trials for other dementia types. Most of the clinical trials out there that are out there are for Alzheimer's disease. However, one of the important things to remember is that it's a neurodegenerative disease. So the more that they learn about Alzheimer's, the more that they're going to learn about Lewy body, the more that they're going to learn about frontal temporal, the more they're going to learn about vascular. So all of it feeds into one another. So that's very important to understand. I've heard it said, I believe it was George Vradenberg from Us Against Alzheimer's, had said that one of the first survivors of Alzheimer's will be one that's in a clinical trial now. So that's why clinical trials are so important. I can't express enough how important they are. One of the sad things, however, is that clinical trials are just that. They're trials. It's research. And sometimes they end, and sometimes they're canceled. Just about 2 weeks ago, I believe it was, Phil, you don't mind if I, okay. Both Phil and I found out, actually Phil notified me that our clinical trial, the one that he and I were both on, was canceled. It ended after, I believe, 7 years. And, it can be very devastating to be part of something for so long. I was in it for 3 years. And, when you dedicate yourself to life to something for 3 years and they end it for whatever reason they have, it can be devastating. And so, but what's really important is that even though the trial was canceled, what's important to understand is that the information that was gathered or gleaned from the clinical trial is not going to go to waste. It's going to be used to further itself toward the goal of curing the disease. And so that's why I feel so proud to have been part of it. And I know, who knows? I'd like to go into another clinical trial if I could. My wife and family don't want me to. They just want me to sit back and relax. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. Here's just a bunch of slides of some of the stuff that I had been doing. As part of your advocacy work and part of the early stage advisory group, what you end up doing is going and participating in lots of events. And for my wife and I, and also for Phil, we got the opportunity to appear in quite a bit of newsprint articles, radio media articles, television articles, television shows, et cetera, et cetera. Kim and I were actually on a television program with Maria Shriver, I think in 2017, which was pretty cool. These are just a bunch of photos here of some of the events that we had participated in. I won't show them all to you because I won't get pressed for time. One of the things that Kim and I are really most excited about, and we just absolutely can't wait for, is the production. And you guys are going to see it. You don't mind, Daphne, if I just mention a little bit, because this production has really become part of our lives. Spent, the Hidden Cost of Dementia, is a production that's being done by Daphne and her husband. Daphne, who's here today, and this has become a really very important part of our lives because it's going to tell a story, a very sincere story about what the cost of dementia is, not just from a financial perspective, but from a human cost on our society. And I think that message can't be told enough. Let's put it that way. It can't be told enough because we don't yet have in place the things that we need to combat the daily things that are that families are afflicted with across the board. Caregivers across the board, the stress, the lack of education, the lack of primary care support across the board. There's so much yet to be done in this country to support families with dementia, and this is one film that's going to, I think, have a very powerful voice in our communities. And Kim and I can't wait for that. One of the things that I have for you today is I have a couple of books, and I was going to kind of raffle them off. Oh, you did? Oh, they're on the back table. So there's a couple of books on the back table. If you'd like, grab a copy. It's from my friend Carmen. They're autographed. She wrote a book called The Sacred Stories from the Other Side of Dementia. It's really kind of a sweet book. It's a very loving, caring book. But she's also the person that did the photographs for us for our Doggies for Dementia. But these are the kind of books, and I haven't read a whole bunch of books from Alz authors. Reading's not that good at it anymore these days. It's hard for me to get through a lot of stuff. But my feeling is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that your books really will instill confidence in people and hope in people. And I think that's really important. And that's part of what the message is for this cruise this week as well. Now here's one of my favorite topics. humor and laughter. I'm not as goofy and funny as I used to be because of the disease, and my wife will tell you that too. I used to be the guy who came into the room and just completely had everybody on the floor laughing. The disease has taken over my brain in such a way where I'm just kind of chill most of the time. But what I do know about laughter and humor is that it's good for you. And what we all need to be able to do is to be able to laugh at ourselves. Laugh at ourselves, laugh with our spouses, with our caregivers, at ourselves, laugh at our caregivers. Right? Now, and this is, I'm not saying, this is not sarcasm, right? Because the definition of sarcasm, if you ever look it up, the definition of sarcasm is to cut at one's skin. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is we want to elevate ourselves with laughter. And you can look up laughter. There's a whole science behind it. It actually relieves stress. It relieves anxiety. It helps with depression. So you have to find things that you can laugh about. You have to be able to laugh at yourself. Kim and I always laugh about me when I walk around small circles. Sometimes at night I'm trying to figure out what to do and I just end up walking around circles like this. And so until Kim would grab my shoulders and say, "Okay, what you looking for?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's what I'm looking for." But you have to be able to laugh at yourself. It's so important, And so find things to laugh about. And the most important thing as we conclude today is that living every day to enjoy life. One day at a time, one moment at a time. Look for joy in new ways. Joy is a choice. I always tell people, joy is a choice. You have to choose joy. It's not something you're kind of born with. You have to find things that are joyful and choose joy. So find those things, choose joy. But also what's really important is to acknowledge the small miracles that are happening in your life. I have Alzheimer's, it's a terminal disease, but I still make an effort to look at the small miracles and find the small miracles in my life. I'll give you one quick example. I couldn't get now even though this trial has ended, it doesn't diminish the fact that to me, it was a small miracle. I couldn't get into a clinical trial that I wanted to get into because it was 100 miles away and I wasn't old enough to be in the trial. It was 65 or older. I'm out on my front lawn looking at my grass. My next door neighbor is out on his front lawn looking at his grass, because that's what you do as neighbors. A new neighbor, you look at your grass, make sure it's growing well. And you talk about your grass, what kind of seed it is, etc. What kind of fertilizer, etc. And so we're having those conversations, and he noticed one of my cars was missing. He said, for a while, he said, "What happened to Kim's car?" And so I went on to tell him that, I was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and I don't drive anymore, so we decided we just don't need two cars. And he said, "My wife just started a new job at a Alzheimer's clinical trial center in Toms River, New Jersey, 10 minutes from here." I said, "You should talk to her." I was in the trial in 2 weeks. That, to me, that is a small miracle. I recognize that as a small miracle, and I'll never forget that as a small miracle. So look for those things. Over the next 7 days, I challenge everyone to find some small miracles as you're walking on the beach, as you're walking around town, as you're communicating with people, as you're having conversations with people, meeting new friends, etc. Look for some small miracles and find some joy. I know we're running late, or...
That's fine, we have time for questions.
Yeah, so if you need to leave for an excursion, please do. If you want to stay, if you have any questions, I'll field those as well. If not, Kim and I will be up at the pool, chilling. So, any questions, Kim?
I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
Earlier you said one of the things that affected you, Jeff, was the ability to sequence. At least that's what I wrote down in my notes, more so than memory. And so my question is it the ability to map out a sequence for yourself, or is it the ability to follow a sequence that's laid out for you?
I know the end point. For instance, a cup of oatmeal. But I have a lot of difficulty with mapping it out. Okay. So for instance, okay, the cup goes here. I put the cup of oatmeal in the cup. Now I add a few things to it, like cinnamon, coconut oil, a little bit of stevia. So a lot of times I go through this process of questioning and asking myself, should I put, well, if I do the coconut oil first, it's going to get the cinnamon all over the spoon with the coconut oil. So I go through this whole process of like questioning myself and trying to figure out, is this the best path for something? Okay. So it's really kind of, it's like process steps. In the past, it'd be like, I don't care, I'm just throwing the whole thing together. But now it's kind of like, it's like you're questioning yourself. And because a lot of times what you're faced with is if you don't question, I have on several occasions put a Keurig coffee cup thing in there, pushed brew, and walked away, and there's coffee all over the counter because I forget to put the cup there. So it's kind of those kind of sequences so that you're constantly making sure you're doing the right thing for the simplest things that most people take for granted. Yeah.
If nobody else has questions, I'll keep going.
Oh, sure.
The myoclonic twitching that was that ultimately attributed to the stress of trying to get to the correct diagnosis?
Yeah, they actually had me with a neurological movement specialist who was basically he had basically diagnosed me at that point, or misdiagnosed me with it was post-myoclonus infectious something or other. I don't know. Did you ever hear anything like that, Lori? Yeah. He had thought it was stemming from a really bad series of stomach viruses that I had, that my body wasn't completely done eradicating from my body. So the theory was that my brain was in overdrive, creating antibodies and causing this myoclonic twitching. That was the theory they were having. So ultimately, they gave me, I think, 5 days of intravenous antibodies or something. I can't remember what it was.
You were in there for 14 days.
I was in there. Okay, I was in there for a while. And then after that, it seemed to get better. But I think it was, for me, honestly, I think it was because I thought that they were getting closer to a diagnosis, so I was feeling less stressful and less anxious. Mm-hmm. So we finally met with him again, I think a couple of weeks later, and he said, honestly, Jeff, I don't know what's wrong with you. Mm-hmm. He said, but I want you to get this book on stress. I want you to read this book on anxiety. And my wife looked at me and she said, we're going up to Columbia Medical Center of Neurology, and that's where the real stuff happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you weren't put like willy-nilly on like muscle relaxant?
Oh no, I was.
Oh, okay.
Like the first diagnosis I had, the first neurologist that saw me thought I had epilepsy. He had me on how many?
5.
5 different epileptic drugs.
Oh.
I was a zombie.
Do you still suffer from them?
No.
Not at all?
No. I mean, every once in a while, if I get really stressed out and nervous, my leg will twitch a little bit, but it's nothing like it was. Nothing like it was. But I was in such a rough shape just from the medication, from the epileptic medication, and then I went to. That was like kind of my local folks over at where I was living at the Jersey Shore. I went to to a neurological place in Pennsylvania where they have some of the best university hospitals in the world, and the epileptic neurologist that was there, the chief, was I think number 6 in the entire world for epilepsy. He looked at my scans and he goes, "This guy doesn't know what he's talking about." He goes, "You don't have epilepsy." So they had to completely flush my system of all the epileptic drugs before they could actually start diagnosing me for anything else. So that's why I was in the hospital for so long.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty nuts.
And was it because of the effect the epilepsy drugs had on you that you continued with, looking for other neurologists?
Yeah, because that wasn't working.
Okay.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, were you still twitching even though you were snowed?
Pretty much.
Oh
Yeah.
my
Yeah,
God.
yeah. That's the thing.
I took him to the ER.
They kept on giving me more drugs and more drugs and more drugs, and I was still twitching.
Okay.
And I think right before we went to the Pennsylvania hospitals, I was like a zombie. These drugs and still twitching. I was just so out of it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but the local doctor is the one who said, "We have to get you to a university.
Yeah,
Something's majorly wrong."
Yeah, he said there's something wrong. I don't know what it
So
is.
they took you by ambulance.
And what's really strange about the whole thing is that all along we were saying, could this be Alzheimer's? And they said, "Nah, you're too young for that. Nah, you're too young for that." All along. But the doctors that we were talking about, one of the issues was that they weren't specialists in Alzheimer's. One of them was a specialist in epilepsy, the other one was a specialist in movement. And so it wasn't their field of study.
Right.
And so they really couldn't advise on it, so to speak.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So, when people say to you things like, "Oh, but you don't look like you have Alzheimer's," or things like that, I'm always so curious about this because
That's a great question.
Nothing irritates me more.
I've worked with so many people, but I'm also the granddaughter of 5 awesome people who had some type of dementia and have 9 experiences in my own family.
Right.
And I think by proxy, I just always want to punch somebody in the face for saying stupid stuff.
Yeah.
But what do you
Yeah, for me.
like?
Yeah.
How do you handle that? Obviously, humor has been kind of a go-to coping strategy for you throughout your life.
Right. That's a great question, and here's exactly how I handle it. First of all, let me tell you, I'm a lollipops and unicorn kind of guy, so everything's just kind of like cool with me. So when somebody says that to me, I don't get offended. What I do is I use it as an opportunity to educate them. I'll say, "Well, what does diabetes look like? See, I have a disease that's in my brain. You can't see it." So that's when I begin to educate them and say, what I have is called younger onset Alzheimer's. It affects people. And then I tell them, I have a friend who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when he was in his early 30s. And so I just use that. I really do just use that as an opportunity to educate them on the disease and really create some dialogue around it. Now, there was one woman.
I want to punch him. I'm like you.
Yeah. There was one woman who got offended when I told her I had Alzheimer's. She thought I was kidding, and she thought I was being like facetious or sarcastic or something. And I had to really kind of explain to her. I was like, "Whoa." She was like, "No, you don't. Don't say that." And I was like, whoa, okay, hold on, let me explain this to you. And then I told her the whole thing, and she understood after that.
Sure.
So, but for me, it's really an education opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's an awareness opportunity. Yeah.
Belinda had
I was just wondering, Ken sometimes says like his brain hurts, you know, I mean, and he gets really tired, like being out and about.
Yeah.
Makes him really tired, as you can see, this
Yeah.
is what he is today,
Yeah.
from yesterday.
Yeah.
Have
Oh,
you
yeah.
experienced that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. There are times when I'll go do an event, and the next day I'm completely out of it.
Yeah.
Completely out of it. Yeah. If I were at an event in the evening, sometimes it's the stimulus. It's the stimulus. It really just affects our brains, and it's just overwhelming. It's just overwhelming. Yeah. And then the result of that is fatigue. It's not just mental fatigue. It's physical fatigue.
I just wanted to add into that.
Yeah. Please.
Basically, at whatever point increasingly I've seen Phil, mental overstimulation is more difficult than physical exercise for him.
Yeah.
And it actually exhausts him quicker. Than,
Another question, same way with eating, does that sometimes exhaust you?
Take a look at it. I'm sorry. I'll say that.
I wish it did.
Yeah, right. We love to eat.
Because, you know, Ken loves to eat too, as he's, you know, but afterwards, sometimes he's just so exhausted.
Well, you know, when you're, I think the scientists could probably describe this better than you, but when after you eat a full meal, I think just naturally you get tired because your body goes into a digestive mode. So then consider somebody who's living with this disease. You know, how easily fatigued we get. Yeah, so you probably, just magnify. I mean, that's the only explanation I can give for that, because I don't get tired after I eat.
Yeah. There's a lot of sequencing to that too, depending on if it's family style or buffet, and who the other people are at the table, if they're providing social cues and visual cues.
Yeah. Like if I'm at home and I have a meal, like this, let's say it's the same portion as I have out, I'm going to have to your point, is very true. I'm going to have a completely different experience cognitively and physically and emotionally than if I'm out at a restaurant where there's noise. I can't focus on who's talking to me. You know, I hear every dish, you know, every fork hit every plate. I mean, there's no filtering. I mean, imagine hearing every sound in the room all at once at the same time.
What about they told us about the ball, the ping pong ball?
A friend of mine described it as that is that it's sometimes it's almost like a pinball table with the ball just bouncing off of things and bells and whistles. Just it's kind of like that. It's just, and what happens is you're there and you're waiting for that ball to kind of slow down and stop and kind of go into the hole before you can start, you know, mentally digesting what just happened. You know, but in the meantime, you're just kind of like a deer in the headlights sometimes. Yeah.
Marcus' question.
I just want to thank you for touching on the stress of getting a true diagnosis.
Oh.
can't imagine.
No, I don't think people can imagine, and no offense to the medical field, but I don't think they have a clue as to the effect that it has on the person affected and their support when they can't give us a diagnosis or a misdiagnosis, because I personally believe that Ron's the most gentle, patient person ever born. But going through the testing and neurologist, and every time we'd have to do one more neurological testing, and he'd like,
Yeah.
and
yeah,
then,
I'm right
I
there
mean,
with you.
we didn't want I mean, I don't think Ron had a clue what Lewy body was, but that was one thing I absolutely did not want to hear.
Yeah.
But when we heard it, to hear this is what you have,
Yeah.
and this is why I know for sure, it was just like, whoa.
Yeah. Oh, you mean there? How did you feel? What's the what is that?
Oh, just
A really-
a total release.
Okay.
A total,
Yeah.
because we've been through so many
Yeah.
testings, and well, you have some sort of dementia. There's nothing we can do for you, and or it's Parkinson's, and then of course, when we finally got the true diagnosis by an unbelievable neurologist, she said, "Do not let anybody
Mhm.
treat the tremors.
Okay.
Do not, because
Yeah.
that's going to exacerbate the
Right.
dementia, and look at him, you don't even see the tremors.
Right.
You wouldn't have recognized him 3-4 years ago, but
Right.
I'm wondering now, listening to you,
Mhm.
whether his tremors were like,
Stress and anxiety
yes,
related.
yes,
I'm not a physician. Couldn't speak to that. I can only give you my experience.
which is a lot better. No offense to the medical field, but
Yeah.
you've lived it, you've walked
Yeah.
it, and listening to you
Yeah.
and walking through that path with Ron. Now
Yeah.
I'm wondering too.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're here to
That's
to share
awesome.
those experiences. But I can tell you that is the same experience that Kim and I and that's why our sorrow and our grief lasted. I mean, you grieve through the entire process of a dementia. I mean, you're constantly grieving, but but there was a relief when I found out I had Alzheimer's,
Yeah.
because it could have been Creutzfeldt-Jakob or that's a 6-month thing, At least I was given the terminal diagnosis that could be years.
But at least you gave something that you could grab a hold
Yes,
of.
yes, I have something tangible now to work with.
To work with.
Yes, yeah, and it's
It's
just
valuable.
such
It's
a bizarre
amazing.
thing.
I know it. No.
It's surreal almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
in our family, we called, because we went through it several times as you have, we called it being in the fog, and we were there was at least some relief from emerging from that fog and kind of naming the beast,
Right.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It has
Yeah.
less power once you can name it, and you
Yes.
can
Right.
begin to put, you can begin to put things in place,
Yeah.
for everyone's care.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's your care too,
Yes.
right? And
Good questions.